The courtroom was tense, filled with an air of anticipation. Reporters, spectators, and legal experts all waited for what was expected to be an explosive hearing. Karoline Leavitt, a fierce political commentator and former White House aide, sat confidently at the defendant's table, her sharp blue eyes locked on the judge. She had been summoned to court over a defamation lawsuit filed by billionaire real estate mogul Darren Whitmore, a man known for using the legal system as a weapon against his critics. Karoline had exposed him in a controversial investigative report, alleging corrupt dealings with government officials. Whitmore, furious at her revelations, had decided to retaliate with a lawsuit, claiming she had fabricated the evidence. At the bench sat Judge Hollister, a man whose reputation for arrogance was only surpassed by his reputation for favoring the wealthy elite. Hollister had a history of dismissing cases against powerful figures and treating those who challenged them with open contempt. As the hearing began, Judge Hollister leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he smirked at Karoline. Well, he said in a condescending tone. Miss Leavitt, I see you've decided to play journalist, but unfortunately for you, the court operates on facts, not the wild fantasies of social media influencers. The crowd murmured, and Karoline's attorney, Michael Harper, immediately rose. Objection, Your Honor. That comment is unprofessional and prejudicial. Judge Hollister scoffed. Overruled. I think we all know what this is. An attention grab by someone desperate to stay relevant. Karoline clenched her jaw but remained composed. She had faced tougher opponents before. She wasn't about to let a biased judge intimidate her. The prosecutor, Robert Garrison, an attorney infamous for defending corporate elites, smirked as he stood to present Whitmore's case. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a clear case of defamation. Miss Leavitt published a so-called exposé on my client, claiming he engaged in unlawful activities. Yet she has failed to produce any legitimate evidence. Karoline's attorney countered immediately. Your Honor, we have extensive documentation, whistleblower testimony, and financial records that point to serious misconduct. We demand a fair trial. Judge Hollister chuckled. Fair? Miss Leavitt, you are not entitled to special treatment simply because you scream the loudest on television. This court is not a stage for your conspiracy theories. Laughter rippled through the courtroom from Whitmore's legal team. Karoline felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just bias, it was a blatant attack on her credibility. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected the judge to outright mock her. She took a deep breath and leaned forward. Your Honor, with all due respect, I came here expecting justice, not insults. Hollister's smirk vanished. His face darkened as he slammed his gavel. Miss Leavitt, you are dangerously close to contempt of court. I suggest you hold your tongue unless spoken to. The air in the courtroom grew thick with tension. Karoline knew she had to tread carefully. But what happened next would change the course of the entire trial, and the judge's life, forever. Judge Hollister's outburst had sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Karoline remained composed, but inside, she was seething. This was no longer just about a lawsuit. This was about power, corruption, and silencing the truth. Her attorney, Michael Harper, leaned over and whispered, Stay calm. He's trying to provoke you. Karoline gave a small nod. She had dealt with power-hungry men before, but Hollister was particularly dangerous. He wasn't just corrupt, he was reckless. The proceedings continued, with Whitmore's legal team attacking Karoline's credibility at every turn. Every time her attorney attempted to present evidence, Judge Hollister would scoff, interrupt, or dismiss it outright. That document is irrelevant, he said, waving away a financial record that showed suspicious offshore transactions. This testimony is hearsay, he declared when a former employee of Whitmore's company tried to testify about shady business deals. It was clear Hollister wasn't just biased. He was actively suppressing evidence. Then, something unexpected happened. During a brief recess, a young clerk, visibly nervous, slipped a folded note into Michael Harper's hand. You didn't get this from me? He whispered before hurrying away. Michael unfolded the note and his eyes widened. He quickly passed it to Karoline. The judge has been paid off. Evidence in his chambers. Be careful. Karoline's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected corruption, but this confirmed it. The problem was, how could they prove it? The court was under Hollister's control, and if they made any wrong move, he could have her held in contempt or worse. As they returned to the courtroom, Karoline knew she had to play this carefully. She locked eyes with Judge Hollister, who smirked as if he had already won. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you ready to concede that your claims are baseless, or do you wish to waste more of this court's time?" Karoline stood up slowly. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a short adjournment." Hollister laughed. "Adjournment? On what grounds?" Karoline met his gaze, unwavering. "I have reason to believe this court has been compromised." Gasps echoed through the room. Hollister's smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice dangerously low. Karoline didn't blink. "I believe there is evidence of judicial misconduct. And if I'm right, you are not fit to preside over this case." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Whitmore's lawyers objected loudly, and Hollister banged his gavel furiously. "Miss Leavitt, I warn you." But Karoline didn't back down. She had the truth on her side. What she didn't know was that within the next hour, the judge would go from being her biggest adversary to the one in handcuffs. Judge Hollister's face turned a deep shade of red. The courtroom had descended into chaos, with reporters whispering among themselves, cameras flashing, and legal analysts hurriedly taking notes. Karoline had thrown a bombshell accusation, and now all eyes were on the judge. His grip tightened on the gavel as he slammed it down. "Order! Order in the court!" Slowly, the murmurs died down, but the tension remained thick. Hollister leaned forward, his tone venomous. "Miss Leavitt, you are skating on very thin ice. If you have an accusation, I strongly suggest you provide evidence, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Karoline held his gaze. "That's exactly what I intend to do." She turned to her attorney. Michael Harper stood up, his voice steady. "Your Honor, we formally request an independent investigation into potential judicial misconduct. Based on information received, we believe there is physical evidence located in your chambers." The judge's reaction was immediate. His lips curled into a sneer, but Karoline caught something else. Panic. "There will be no such investigation," Hollister snapped. "This is an outrageous attempt to delay the trial. I will not tolerate these baseless accusations in my courtroom." Karoline folded her arms. "If you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear." The judge opened his mouth to retort, but at that moment, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Two uniformed officers and a federal investigator walked in. "Judge Hollister," the lead officer said, his voice steady but firm. "We have received a formal request from the state attorney's office to conduct an immediate review of potential evidence related to judicial misconduct." Collective gasp filled the courtroom. Hollister's jaw tightened. "You can't be serious," he spat. "You have no authority to barge into my courtroom." The federal investigator calmly pulled out a warrant. "Actually, we do." The judge's hands clenched into fists. His gaze darted toward Whitmore, who sat at the plaintiff's table, looking equally stunned. Karoline didn't miss the silent exchange between them. It was the look of two men who knew they had been caught. The officers wasted no time. Two of them disappeared into the judge's chambers while the lead investigator remained in the courtroom. Hollister was visibly seething, his control over the situation slipping through his fingers. Minutes passed and then, "Sir," one of the officers called from the chambers. "We found something." A tense silence followed. Then, the officer stepped back into the courtroom, holding a small, black leather briefcase. Karoline's breath hitched. The officer placed it on the evidence table and opened it carefully. Inside were stacks of cash, financial documents, and, most damning of all, a burner phone. The federal investigator took one look and nodded. "Judge Hollister, this evidence directly ties you to unlawful financial transactions, including large deposits from offshore accounts linked to Darren Whitmore." Gasps rippled through the courtroom once more. Whitmore shot up from his seat. "This is ridiculous. You can't seriously believe." The investigator turned to him. "Mr. Whitmore, you'll have your turn. But for now." He looked back at Hollister. "Judge Hollister, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, bribery, and judicial corruption." The entire courtroom froze as the officers approached the bench. Hollister's eyes were wild, his authority shattered. "You will regret this," he growled, his voice low. "All of you." Karoline simply watched, arms crossed, as the once powerful judge was led away in handcuffs. As Judge Hollister was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the tension in the air finally cracked. The reporters who had been silently observing now erupted into a frenzy, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a chorus of questions. Karoline sat still, taking in the moment. She had faced powerful enemies before, but bringing down a corrupt federal judge in real time? This was something different, something bigger. Darren Whitmore, still standing, looked like he had just seen a ghost. His face was drained of color, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to protest but couldn't find the words. Michael Harper stood up, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor." He stopped himself, smirking slightly as he glanced at the empty judge's chair. "Well, I suppose we no longer have a presiding judge for this case." The federal investigator turned to the bailiff. "Court is adjourned until further notice. This case will be reassigned to a new, impartial judge." Whitmore snapped out of his daze. "This is a setup," he barked. "You have no proof that I was involved in any of this." Karoline finally stood, smoothing her blazer. "Really, Darren? Because that burner phone in Hollister's chambers tells a different story." Whitmore's eyes flickered with something. Fear? Anger? Probably both. "That doesn't mean anything." Michael let out a short laugh. "You sound awfully nervous for an innocent man." Whitmore glared at Karoline. "You think this is over?" He pointed a finger at her. "You don't know what you've just started." Karoline didn't flinch. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Whitmore could hear. "No, Darren. You don't know what I've started." The billionaire clenched his jaw and stormed out of the courtroom, his legal team scrambling after him. The moment he was gone, reporters swarmed Karoline. "Miss Leavitt, did you know the judge was corrupt before today? What's your next move? Do you think Whitmore will face charges?" Karoline held up a hand. "I'll be making a public statement later. But for now," she turned toward the federal investigator. "I believe there are more people who need to be held accountable." The investigator nodded. "We're already working on it. And you might want to keep your schedule open, Miss Leavitt." She raised a brow. "Why's that?" He gave her a knowing look. "This might just be the beginning of something much bigger." As she walked out of the courtroom, Karoline knew she had just made a powerful enemy in Whitmore. But she also knew one thing for certain. She had just exposed a conspiracy that went deeper than anyone had imagined. And she wasn't done yet. The courthouse steps were flooded with reporters. Karoline Leavitt stood at the center of the chaos, cameras flashing around her. Microphones were shoved toward her face as journalists fired questions like bullets. "Miss Leavitt, do you believe Judge Hollister acted alone? Will you pursue charges against Darren Whitmore? What does this mean for your reputation, now that you've exposed judicial corruption?" Karoline took a deep breath, lifting her chin. "Let me be very clear," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is not just about one corrupt judge. This is about an entire system that allows the wealthy and powerful to buy their way out of accountability. Judge Hollister was just the first domino to fall." A murmur ran through the crowd. She continued, "Darren Whitmore thought he could use the legal system to silence me. Instead, we uncovered evidence of bribery, fraud, and judicial corruption at the highest levels. And let me tell you something, I'm not stopping here." More questions erupted, but Karoline didn't stay to answer. She turned, walking down the courthouse steps with her attorney at her side. Michael Harper smirked. "That was quite the speech." She shrugged. They deserved the truth. But as they reached their car, Michael's expression turned serious. You know Whitmore won't take this lying down, right? Karoline sighed. Oh, I'm counting on it. Meanwhile, Darren Whitmore sat in his high-rise office, his hands gripping the edges of his desk. His lawyer, Franklin Dale, stood in front of him, shifting uncomfortably. This is bad, Franklin muttered. With the evidence they found in Hollister's chambers, federal prosecutors will start digging into all your dealings. Whitmore's jaw tightened. I don't pay you to tell me what I already know. Franklin hesitated. Then what do you want me to do? The billionaire leaned back in his chair, eyes dark and calculating. We need to discredit Karoline Leavitt. Make her look like a liar, a fraud, whatever it takes. Franklin nodded, but he still looked uneasy. And if that doesn't work? Whitmore's lips curled into a cold smile. Then we find another way to shut her up. The breaking point. The next morning, Karoline woke up to a storm brewing in the media. News outlets were running hit pieces on her, labeling her a fake journalist and a political opportunist. Her personal emails had been leaked, twisted to make her look like she had fabricated evidence. Online trolls were flooding her social media with threats. It was clear Whitmore had gone to war. Michael called her as soon as he saw the headlines. They're coming after you hard. We need to respond. Karoline exhaled sharply. No, let them think they're winning. Michael frowned. What do you mean? She smirked. I have one last move. That evening, Karoline sat across from a top federal prosecutor in a dimly lit conference room. A thick file lay on the table between them. This is everything, she said, sliding the folder forward. Financial records, offshore accounts, direct proof that Whitmore was paying off multiple judges, not just Hollister. The prosecutor flipped through the documents, nodding. This is more than enough to bring formal charges. Karoline leaned back. Then do it. The prosecutor gave her a firm look. You realize this will destroy Whitmore's empire? She smiled. That's the point. 1 week later, breaking news alerts flashed across every major network. Billionaire Darren Whitmore indicted on multiple counts of bribery and fraud. Karoline Leavitt's investigation sparks federal probe into judicial corruption. Former Judge Hollister turns state witness against Whitmore. Karoline watched the news unfold from her apartment, sipping her coffee. She had won. Not just the case, but the war. Michael called, laughing. You really did it. She grinned. Yeah, I did. Whitmore's power had crumbled. The system he had abused for years had finally turned on him. And Karoline? She wasn't just a journalist anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with.